Good, the Sikha is Chelek Zayin, Emor Aleph. The Sikha is a little shorter than many of the other Sikhas in this Sefer. And it is a Rashi Sikha, a Sikha that is going to focus on one of the Klolei Rashi, one of the rules, the principles that the Rebbe taught us in the Pirush of Rashi, is to focus on the Dibur HaMaschil. That the words of the Dibur HaMaschil, the words that the Rashi quotes from the Pasuk, are very relevant either to understanding what is bothering Rashi or to understanding the explanation that Rashi is going to give. And this Sikha focuses on a Dibur HaMaschil in this parsha. It has been spoken numerous times about the utmost precision, the ultimate precision in the wording of Rashi on Torah. Nicht nur die Wörter von seinem Pirush, nur echt die Wörter von Pasuk, was ist meitig, fahr dem Onit von seinem Pirush. Not only the words of Rashi's Pirush, but also the words that he chooses to quote from the Pasuk before giving us his Pirush, which we often refer to as the Dibur HaMaschil. That also the words of the Dibur HaMaschil are also precise and chosen specifically. And based on that, there is an explanation required on a certain Rashi in this parsha. In Onim from Parshas Hamayados, in the beginning of the parsha of Yomim Tovim, which takes up a section in Parshas Emor, Noch der Akdame vayidaber goymer, daber ob bnei Yisrael goymer, meyadei Hashem goymer, elei meyadei, after the first pasuk, or first two psukim, where he introduces that the Eibishter are speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, that we're about to speak about the Moyadim, the Yomim Tovim. Zok der Pasuk, the Pasuk says, Sheishes Yomim te'asem alacha, uvayem hashvi Shabbos Shabbosain, mikra kedesh kol malacha leisasu gomer. That 6 days a week work shall be done. And on the seventh day, it is Shabbos Shabbosain, it is a Shabbos of Shabbos. Mikra Kodesh, it is designated as a holy day, and no malacha should be done on this day. When the Nach is the Torah mamshich and the psukim nachtim, and then the Torah continues in the following psukim, Eile Moyadei Hashem, these are the Yomim Tovim. When Nechen Tois Ala Moyadim and mentions, and all of the Yomim Tovim starts with Pesach, and then Sfiras, the days of the Omer, the Karban Omer, and then Shavuos, then Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot. From them pasuk is Rashi meitik tiver sheishes yamim. So from this pasuk Gimel, Rashi quotes the words, just the words sheishes yamim, 6 days, and is mefarish and explains as follows: Ma inyan Shabbos etzel moyades. What's the connection of Shabbos to the Yom Tovim? And the question basically is that there's a major difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos. That Shabbos is every seventh day. It's chosen by the Eibishter that every seventh day is Shabbos. Yomim Tovim were designated by Bezdin because when it came to the Chodesh, Bezdin would be Mekadesh the Chodesh, would bring on the new month, and based on the day that Bezdin was Mekadesh the Chodesh, if it was Tishrei, that day, the next day would become Rosh Hashanah. 10 days later would be Yom Kippur. 15 days later would be Sukkot. If it's Nisan, then 15 days later would be Pesach, and 50 days after that would be Shavuos. So the Yomim Tovim are based on the designation of human beings, Bezdin, but human beings. So that's what they're called. They're chosen or they're designated by Bezdin. So L'cheira, Shabbos and Yom Tov are so different. So Rashi asks the question, which Chazal ask, why is Shabbos included here together with the Yom Tovim if they are so different? And Rashi answers the question, to teach you, that somebody who desecrates a Yom Tov, it is considered as if he desecrated the Shabbos, even though one might think that Yom Tov is less stringent than Shabbos because after all it's man-made or man-designated. Nevertheless, you have to know that if a person chas v'shalom desecrates a Yom Tov, it's as if he desecrated Shabbos. And someone who properly observes the Yom Tovim, Mailin alav, it's considered kilukim as Shabbos. It's as if he observed Shabbos, even though Shabbos is in a certain sense on a higher level. Nevertheless, if someone keeps Yom Tov, it's as if they kept Shabbos. Is nit move on. So that's the Rashi. So we have to ask the following question. The question that's being asked here, as Rashi himself says it, what is the connection between Shabbos and the Yom Tovim? Rashi should have brought the words on the seventh day of Shabbos, so that he can ask, why are we discussing Shabbos when we're supposed to be discussing Yom Tovim? And shtod them, bringt Sheshes Yomim. Instead, Rashi brings the words Sheshes Yomim, und bei Yom Shvi Shabbos daiter afilu nit on durch zugeben dem Wort v'goymer. And he doesn't even allude to the words of Shabbos by saying v'goymer, by saying etc. He says Sheshes Yomim, 6 days, and doesn't even say v'goymer, as totally ignoring the fact that this pasuk is talking about Shabbos. He only focuses on the word Sheshes Yomim, and that's a question. Seemingly, Rashi's Pirush is about the day of Shabbos, so he should have said of Vayom Shvi Shabbos, or at least said of a Goymar after Sheshes Yomim. So now the Rebbe is going to suggest an answer. He's going to suggest that maybe Sheshes Yomim is not to tell us the content of the Rashi, but it is to bring it as an introduction. That sometimes Rashi brings the beginning of a pasuk to tell you that he's going to talk about the entire pasuk, and only brings the first few words of the pasuk, even though some of the later words of the pasuk are more connected to the Pirush of Rashi. So he's going to suggest that as an answer, and he's going to say that it's not a good answer. Lernen, als mit meitig sein Sheshes Yomim is Rashi oisen. Nicht gebracht hat zwei Wörter k'shelatzmam, nor als Cholov from the ganze pasuk. Seemingly we can answer that when Rashi brings the word Sheshes Yomim, he's not here to tell us that these are the important words to know. These are the words that are going to be addressed in the Rashi, but he's bringing them as the beginning of the pasuk to tell us that we're going to talk about the pasuk. As we find in a number of places, as Rashi is maitik the ascholof on a pasuk, or from an inyan that Rashi quotes the beginning of a pasuk or the beginning of a concept. Not even adding the word v'goymar, which means etc. Und sein Pirush bazieht sich zum ganzen pasuk oder inyan, and his commentary, his Pirush, is addressing the whole pasuk and the whole idea, even though he only brought the very beginning of that pasuk or that idea. Ula dugma. And we bring two examples. Number one, afan pasuk v'asu esa eifed, and the pasuk v'asu esa eifed, which is in Parshas Tetzaveh, Zogt Rashi says, in basi lefarish chulu, that if I would try to explain each part of the pasuk individually, it would be very difficult to give a good picture of what the ephod looked like. Therefore, I'm going to explain the whole thing in this Rashi over here. Und is mefarish und mevayer alle Protem von Asiyas Ephod, verstehen in the ganze Parsha. And then Rashi goes and explains all of the details of making the ephod. The ephod was an apron-like beged garment that the Kohen Gadol wore from his waist down, with it tied in the front and it hung in the back. It was like an apron, but the opposite of the way we would wear an apron, where the material hung in the back and the belt tied in the front. Now it's called the ephod. So Rashi explains all the details. Und von deswegen is Rashi meitig von Pasuk nor die Wörter v'asu es ephod non der esav v'gemer. Even though Rashi is explaining many details about the ephod that are mentioned in the Pasuk, he only quotes the words v'asu es ephod, and they will make the ephod. So we see that Rashi quotes the beginning of the pasuk and is implying that in this Rashi, I'm not just going to speak about the word ephod, I'm going to speak about many of the ideas that are discussed in the pasuk. Azoyech in Pirush Rashi was kumt gleich noch sein Pirush of Sheshes Yomim. So too in the Rashi in this parsha, which comes in the next pasuk Daled, right after the Rashi of Sheshes Yomim. And if in pasuk Elamaya de Hashem mikroi kodesh asher tikroi some b'mayadam on the pasuk of Elamaya de Hashem, where Rashi is mefarish dem tam hakefel from the ganzen pasuk, where Rashi is explaining why the whole pasuk is repetitive. It's repetitive, first of all, to pasuk Beis, where it already said, Meyadei Hashem, Asher Tikru Eisem Mikrei Kodesh, Eilehei Meyadei, and then it's repetitive in Pasuk Daled itself, Eile Meyadei Hashem Mikrei Kodesh, Asher Tikru Eisem, etc. So Rashi addresses the repetitiveness in the Pasuk. Von deswegen is meitig nach Aschala Sakasuf, Eile Meyadei Hashem Unon V'Gomer. Nevertheless, the Dibra Maschil only quotes the first three words of the Pasuk, Eile Meyadei Hashem, and without even a Gomer. So here are two examples where Rashi is talking about the whole Pasuk and only quotes the first few words of the Pasuk. So possibly we can apply that same reasoning to here, that even though he's talking about the whole Pasuk, which is about Shabbos, he says the word Sheishes Yamim, which is the beginning of the Pasuk. But that explanation cannot be used in this case. Weil Rashi banugen sich mit, meitig sein Aschala Sakasuf Inyan, nor dann, wenn die Aschala enthält, L'chalapachis atel von dem Teichen ha'inyan v'cheres mefarish. Rashi only suffices with the beginning of the pasuk if the beginning of the pasuk contains at least part of the theme, the idea that he will be speaking about. Al derech, wie in die Dugmais anal, similar to these above mentioned examples. Rashi banugen sich nit mit meitig sein v'asu. Rashi doesn't suffice with just the word v'asu, nor is Moshe eich v'asu esa eifet. He adds the words esa eifet. Well, das is the nekuda was retzach in sein pirish, because that's what he's going to talk about. He's going to talk about the eifet. Asi esa eifet. Al derech zein pasuk eila meyadei Hashem is meitig nit blois eila. No, eila meyadei Hashem. He doesn't say the word eila. He says the word eila meyadei Hashem because he's going to talk about meyadei Hashem. In unser Fall, but in our case, in Pirish Rashi does negia der ma'inyan Shabbos v'chulu. Rashi is focusing on the connection of Shabbos to the Mayadais. So this pasuk he would be focusing on the Shabbos aspect of it. Und die Wörter Sheishes Yamim geben it arois, afilu nit atel von the minyan Shabbos. The word 6 days has nothing to do with Shabbos. It's the 6 days. It's not Shabbos. So you can't say that Rashi is quoting it as the beginning of the pasuk because the Sheishes Yamim does not address any aspect of Rashi's Pirush. If it would have, like in the pasuk Vasu Esa Eifod, then you could say Sheishes Yamim. Rashi is just beginning the pasuk to tell you that he's going to talk about the whole pasuk. But it can only works if the words that Rashi are quoting actually address some of what Rashi is going to speak about. Here Rashi talks about, it quotes Sheishes Yamim and then talks about Shabbos. So that explanation cannot work in this case. Noch Hashayla in Lashon Rashi, there's another question in the words of Rashi. This till now we were speaking about the Dibur HaMaschil. Now in Siv Gimel, we're going to ask on the actual Rashi. Why does Rashi start with a negative that if someone desecrates Yontif, it's as if he desecrated Shabbos? Why doesn't he begin with a positive? Whoever observes or fulfills or keeps the Yontif is as if he kept Shabbos. Befrat as the pasuk was vergleicht say, red bechiyus mirasam. Especially the pasuk in which he's using to compare Shabbos and the Yom Tovim. The psukim here are talking about keeping Yom Tov. They're talking about how to observe the Yom Tov. So it should have began with the fact that if you do observe Yom Tov, it's as if you observe Shabbos. Und Chach der Pirush in them to say that he's going to win Gourarie for Teras Kehanim. So even though Rashi is just quoting from the Teras Kehanim, so in Teras Kehanim the Machadal comes first, and therefore that's how Rashi phrases it. So that is not a good enough answer for why Rashi does it this way for two reasons. First of all, the Teras Kehanim is not addressing this pasuk. The Teras Kehanim is speaking in a more general sense on the importance of keeping Yom Tov, and says that whoever keeps Yom Tov is as if they kept Shabbos. But here we're talking about a specific pasuk, so we have to be more consistent to the pasuk, which is talking about Kiyum HaMoedos, the fulfillment, the observance of the Yom Tovim. So that's one point. In addition to that, is the Yadua v'Gered v'Shem Kam v'Kam Pamim, as Rashi v'Pirusha is nit meitig ma'merazal davki b'l'shenom. That Rashi, it's been spoken many times, that Rashi does not necessarily quote Ma'amorei Chazal verbatim, nor v'es gita as barim psudishal mikra u'nechen as asignen. Rashi is going to rephrase the words of Chazal so that they should be more understood according to traditional Mikra. So in this case, since the pasuk that Rashi is talking about is about Kiyum HaMayades, it would have been more consistent with traditional Mikra to start with Kol HaMakayim HaMayades. So even though the Teras Kehanim says it differently, number one, the Teras Kehanim is not talking about this pasuk, and number two, Rashi does not obligate himself to quote the Medrash verbatim. He'll quote it at best the way it works for traditional Mikra. So we're having a question. So we're back to our question: why does Rashi begin with a negative? You always, when you speak to a person, you say, "Please do this for me." If you don't do it, there's a consequence. So we should have started Kol Makayim Esamayades, and then say Kol Machal Esamayades, and say the severity of the negative. Now we're going to suggest another answer. Mitzugleich in Yom Tov zu Shabbos is after Pasuk Beikir Uisen zu Bavarenen, wir sollen Mekel sein in Asiyas Malacha be Yom Tov. The reason why we have to compare Shabbos and Yom Tov is because we want to caution the person that he should not be lenient when it comes to doing Malacha on Yom Tov. Trachtendik, a person might think, like we said before, as the ganze Kvius. Mainly, Yisr Malacha of Yom Tov is totally in Bezdin, that the whole designation of this day of Yom Tov, and therefore the subsequent prohibition of Malacha, is dependent on Bezdin, and therefore a person might think that it's not so severe, and therefore the pasuk has to tell me that to compare Shabbos and Yom Tov, that in this regard they're on the same level. Und der Fahr besteht dort der Iker Adgashe v'Azara in Kol HaMachal HaMayades Meilen Alav Kilachilas HaShabbases. And therefore the most important emphasis here is to tell the person that if you desecrate the Yom Tov, if you think that Yom Tov is not so important and therefore you could do Malacha on Yom Tov, it's going to be considered as if you desecrated Shabbos. Rashi begins with a primary message that you don't be mechalel because it's as if you're doing a chilul Shabbos. And there's enough right to the memshachol and then brings the continuation in the positive sense. So that in other words, the answer we might suggest is that the negative is the more important message here. Don't think that Yom Tov is less important than Shabbos. Aber der Tiris is nicht maspik. But also this reason is insufficient. Rabbi bald as the dimi for Yom Tov to Shabbos werden pasuk ausgedrückt. Nicht durch a Schlile von Chilul Shabbos Yom Tov, nor durch dem Chiyuv and Sivu von Shmiras v'Kiyum HaMayades, since the comparison in the pasuk of Shabbos and Yom Tov is not in the negative, in the prohibition against the Chilul Shabbos and Yom Tov, but it's in the positive, in the commandment to keep and observe the Yomim Tevim, ufun dem led, ben of the minyan for Kol Machal, and it's from the how to observe Yom Tov that we learn this Kol Machal, which is in Teres Kehanim. Had Rashi gedarft and Pirush HaKosuv. So if Rashi is explaining what the pasuk is telling me, and the pasuk is telling me the chiyuv, the positive, Rashi should have also eichschreiben nor dem chiyuv. Rashi should have written just about the chiyuv. The pasuk only focuses on the chiyuv. Or that I'll call upon him Shaiban like and say that we learned this off in pasuk. Or at least, if you want to mention the negative, write in the order that how it is in the pasuk. First, first focus on the positive, which is what the pasuk is talking about, and then you could mention the negative. So we wanted to suggest that the comparison of Shabbos and Yom Tov is primarily focusing on the negative. And that's why Rashi starts with a negative. And we refuted that answer by saying that Rashi here is coming as to explain the pasuk. And the pasuk is speaking about the positive. The pasuk is speaking about Kiyum HaMayades. And therefore Rashi should have began with Kol HaMakayim HaMayades. So now we're at Sif Daled and we're going to answer the question. And we're going to change your understanding of what's bothering Rashi. Till now, though, what's bothering Rashi is why is there a mention of Shabbos over here? And we're going to see that that's not what's bothering Rashi. What's bothering Rashi is something entirely different. What's bothering Rashi is not why Shabbos is mentioned, but why the 6 days are mentioned. Why does the pasuk have to mention 6 days a week, work shall be done? And that's why Rashi says Sheishes Yamim in the Dibur HaMaschil. And that's what Rashi is coming to explain to us with this comparison of Shabbos and Yom Tov. The Bir Bazeh, here is the explanation. It's just so beautiful. The Shaila Mayin Shabbos Eitzel Moyados B'Negei Shabbos Farzich is nit ken Greise Tmiim Sudish Mikra. The question, how is Shabbos brought in amongst the other Moyados? If you're talking about Shabbos, is not such a great question. Not such a big question in Pshudish Mikra. As a matter of fact, he mentions in the Hora that Barbanel says that Rashi's Pirush is al derech hadrash, which is there's Pshat, there's Remesh, there's Drush, and there's Sod. Usually Rashi is Pshat, Pshudish Mikra. The Barbanel says here, this is not Pshudish Mikra, this is Drush. Because al Pshudish Mikra, there's no question why or there's not, I shouldn't say no question, but there's less of a question. Ma'in Shabbos Eitzel Moyados. Why Shabbos is mentioned amongst the Yom Tovim. As many of the other commentaries on Torah explain, Shabbos is included in the Moyadim, in the festival concept, because it can be called a designated day. It's a unique day, one that is asr, prohibited to do malacha on it. And therefore, it's a moyed. It's different than the rest of the week. It's designated for certain things. And even if you're going to say that Shabbos cannot be included in the Moyadei Hashem that are designated by the people, it could still be explained as their pasuk, their mon b'derech agav against Shabbos, that the pasuk is mentioning about Shabbos at least on the side, so to speak, like mentioning as an aside, mentioning Shabbos, the mechilik between Shabbos and Yom Tov, to at least tell us that there's a distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Aleph Shabbos is nitoli in Bezdin. Mashayka Yom Tov, the Shabbos is not dependent on Bezdin. It's not designated by Bezdin. It happens every single seventh day, regardless of what any Bezdin might come and say. And unlike Yom Tov, which is dependent on Bezdin to know exactly which day it is, Beis Shabbos v'tangeru von Eich Shabbos Shabbosin. Shabbos is also called not just Shabbos, the Shabbos Shabbosin in this pasuk here in Parshas Emor. About Eich Melechas Eichel Nefesh is also Mashayk and Yom Tov, because on Shabbos, even Eichel Nefesh, even Melacha that is connected with food preparation, is also Mashayk and Yom Tov, where food preparation is mutter. So either you're going to call Shabbos a Yom Moed because it's a designated day, or if you want to separate Shabbos from the Yom Tovim, then that itself explains why Shabbos is mentioned here. To separate it from Yom Tov, to say that even though it's Asr b'Malacha, but nevertheless it's different than Bezdin, than Shabbos, because it is also Eichel Nefesh is Asr, and it's not totally in Bezdin. So Rashi is not bothered by the mention of Shabbos here. The Tmiyah for Rashi is da b'shayches l'rakdama to Shabbos. What's perplexing Rashi is the intro to Shabbos. Sheishes Yom Tiyas Melacha. That the pasuk over here says on 6 days a week you should do work. But Merishton Tzivi in the Torah of Shabbos, by the first commandment in Torah, which is Naser Sadibris, where it tells us to keep Shabbos, is move of us with our active. It's understood why you have to introduce it with 6 days a week you should work. Because the Torah is commanding us about the prohibition of work on Shabbos. So the pasuk tells us first we shouldn't worry about our livelihood. Because in 6 days a week you could work and make yourself a parnasa. You could do your work. Here he's going to give us two more reasons why in Parashas Yisro it makes sense to say Sheishes Yom Tasa. Aleph, the Akdama Sheishes Yom V'Gemer is behesem zum Hemshech HaKos of Dart. It's consistent with the continuation of the pasuk there, as the time of Shmira Shabbos is Kishesh Hashem Moshe Hashem Gomer Vayonach Vayimashvi. Because the reason why we're resting on Shabbos is because in 6 days a week Hashem created the world, and on the 7th day He rested. So therefore we work for 6 days and we rest on Shabbos. So it makes sense to mention the 6 days a week you should work, because it's consistent with the 6 days in which the Eibusher created the world. Base. Another reason why it makes sense to add Sheishes Yamim in over there in Aseres Adibris. For Sheishes Yamim Tavid Vasisa Kamalachtecha, let it men up. Rashi brings this up. Rashi brings the Maimer Chazal that teaches us from the word Sheishes Yamim Tavid that we learn Kishatave Shabbos, that when Shabbos comes, Yehei Beinecha Kilu Kamalachtecha Asuya V'chulu, it should be in your eyes as if all your work is done. In other words, 6 days a week you should work, and then comes Shabbos, not only you should not work, but you should consider it as if you have no work. And this, since this limud is learned from Sheish Hashem and Tavod, that when you go into Shabbos, you have to be in such a state of rest that it's as if all of your malacha was already done. And therefore, that's to say Sheish Hashem and Tavod. So we have 3 points. Number one, it's the first time it's mentioning Shabbos, and therefore he has to tell us that we can make a parnasa by working 6 days. Number two, it's telling us about the 6 days because it's similar to the 6 days that Hashem created the world. And number three, it's telling us about the 6 days to tell us that when Shabbos comes, it should be as if Kol Malach Techasuya. Oh, but in Parashas Emor was Nidiri Kirart of Shabbos. I believe in the Hara 13, also in Vayakel, it says Sheish Hashem Tavod. And the reason for that is because the main thrust of that parsha is to build a Mishkan. So he said, 6 days a week you should build the Mishkan. On the 7th day you should rest. So again over there we understand why it says Sheish Yamim. Oh, Berdaim Parshas Emor Vasis Nidariker Artefasar Shabbos, which is not the primary place for the prohibition of Shabbos. It's only being mentioned casually, so to speak, because the Yamim Tovim stellt sich die Shaila, was for a Sheiches hat die Akdama Sheish Yamim for Shabbos to the Me'odis. What connection does the intro, that 6 days a week you should work, what connection does that have to Yom Tov? The Torah gedarft on even by Yemesh Shvi Shabbos Abbas, and Torah should have begun the pasuk with the words that the 7th day Shabbos Abbasin. Und die Schale von Verdashi durch Maktim sein, dass Chazal sagen, mein Shabbos ist mehr, das Lamm doch Kol Machal. And this is the question that Rashi is answering by bringing the Maimer Chazal, that what is the connection of Shabbos to Yom Tov, to tell you that if you desecrate Yom Tov, it's as if you desecrated Shabbos, etc., etc. As the pasuk will dazu gleich die Harbkeit von Asiyas Malach b'Me'odis to the Harbkeit von Asiyas Malach b'Shabbos. The pasuk here is trying to compare the severity of doing Malacha on Yom Tov to doing Malacha on Shabbos, to the severity of doing Malacha on Shabbos. And once we realize that the whole thrust of this pasuk is to understand the severity of doing Malacha on Yom Tov, we'll understand why the pasuk says Sheishes Yamim Tiyasa Malacha. And that'll answer Rashi's question, why 6 days a week is mentioned in this pasuk. So the Nekudas Habir here is that what's bothering Rashi is the words Sheishes Yamim Tiyasa Malacha in our pasuk, and Rashi to explain to us why the pasuk starts out with these words. The Rashi brings this Maimer Chazal that the point of this pasuk is to underscore to us the severity of Malacha on Yom Tov and to compare it to the severity of Malacha on Shabbos. And once we realize how that works, we'll understand why the pasuk has to begin with Sheishes Yamim. Sifei. The Asbara in them. So let's explain what's the connection over here between the comparison of Shabbos and Yom Tov and the Sheishes Yamim. And there's a very important point that he makes over here, and that Sheishes Yamim is not a number of days, but Sheishes Yamim is a concept in time. That's going to be the Nekudas HaHesber, the main point of the explanation is that Sheishes Yamim, when it says 6 days, it's not just referring to 6 separate days, it's referring to a unit of time, to one concept of time which comes with its own set of halacha, or its own set of permissibility. Sheishes Yomim badait nit bloß das Schum von 6 besondere Tag. When we say Sheishes Yomim, it doesn't just signify an amount, a number of 6 individual days. Nor semeint euch am Metzius von ein Sach in Zman in Bestand von Sheishes Yomim. It's referring to an entity in time, one unit of time that's made up of 6 days. If you actually ties with that psukim weiter, Rashi says in a few psukim in this same parsha, kol mokim, any place. So nemar shiv'as shem davaru shavua shel yamim. Whenever it says shiv'as yamim, not a shiv'o yamim or something like that, shiv'as is referring to a name of something. It is a week of days. It is a unit of 7 days. So too, whenever it says, actually says, whenever it says Shmei Nas or Sheishes, it doesn't say Shmei Na Yamim, it says Shmei Nas Yamim. Ein sechs Tagike, oder 7 Tagike, oder 8 Tagike Tkufa. It's one unit of 6 days or 7 days or 8 days, but it's referring to the oneness, to the unit of it. So it says, let's say Shmei Nas Yamim, it's not just 8 individual days, it's a unit of 8 days. And that's what the pasuk means over here when it says Sheishes Yom 6 days. The Melacha should be done. The Eibishter hat gegeben an uns geteilte Metzius von Sheishes Yomim. The Eibishter gave us a distinct entity of 6 days. But nor in here is the late Givar Nasiyas Melacha, which only in that entity of time Melacha is permitted. Das heißt, als die alle Zmanim was eine nietende Tkufa von die Wochen, die Sheishes Yomim im Me'achol, any other time that would not be included in the mundane 6 days, in the mundane unit that's made up of 6 days, then Asam Malacha. It's Asam Malacha. So in other words, Sheishes Yomim Tiyas Malacha, there's a certain entity of time in which Malacha is permissible. Any other time, Malacha is not allowed. Al Pizeh is Muzber was the Torah is Makdim and Anim from Parshas Hamoed Sheishes Yom Tiyas Malacha. This explains why the Torah begins this entire section about Yomim Tovim with these words: Sheishes 6 days a week, Malacha should be done. Der mit is the Torah Magdir zwei Klolos dike Tkufis v'sugi Zman b'negias Yis Malacha. The Torah is identifying and structuring 2 distinct time units with regards to Malacha. Aleph Tesman for Sheishes Yomim versus Mutter b'Malacha, Te'asa Malacha. The entity of time called Sheishes Yomim, which is Malacha is permissible in that time. Beis Yeder Andesman Asa Malacha. Any other time that cannot be classified as Sheishes Yomim is Asa b'Malacha. Mir ist verstandig, was man lernt auf der Funes Kol Machal, as Amedes Chulu Kila Kila Shvasas, Kol Mekhaim Kulu Kila Kimis Shvasas. Now we understand how we're reaching this conclusion that anybody that desecrates Yom Tov is as if he desecrated Shabbos, and anybody that observes Yom Tov is as if he observed Yom Tov, as if he observes Shabbos. Chotz has been again some Eines V'Keitz B'Zeh is nicht gleich dem Isser from the Siyas Malacha Yom Tov Mitzvah Shabbos, even though with regards to the consequences that a person is liable for doing malacha, Shabbos and Yom Tov is different. Or Bechlal is asiyas malacha b'Yom Tov v'balz is nit nichlul in Sheishes Yomim in zelben suk v'Shabbos. But generally speaking, besides for the consequences, generally speaking, the doing malacha and Yom Tov, since it's not part of Sheishes Yomim, is in the same category as doing malacha and Shabbos, which is also not in the Sheishes Yomim, and therefore it's kiluchilas Shabbos. It's as if he desecrated Shabbos. So we didn't get to answer all of our questions, but one thing we're now learning, and that is that the Eibishter created permissible time. Any other time that's not in that permissible time, it's not permissible. So in that aspect, Shabbos and Yom Tov are exactly the same. They're both not part of the Sheishes Yomim, and therefore they are both Asr, and they're similar. If you're mechalel this, it's like you're mechalel that, because they're both not part of the Sheishes Yomim, and that's the chiddush of this parsha. The parsha is telling us that anything that's not in the Sheishes Yomim is Asr b'Malach. Pizeh is moving, was Rashi is meitig blaze die Werte Sheishes Yomim v'Geimer. Sheishes Yomim, sorry. Geht dabei nicht zu I feel the word v'goymar. Now we understand why Rashi starts with the word sheishes yomim and does not even say the word v'goymar. Midem is madgish. Rashi is emphasizing as sheishes yomim is an uyis getelter inyan zug for sich. The sheishes yomim is a distinct and a separate concept, independent of the rest of the pasuk. Und der Hemshech HaKasuv by Yom HaShvi v'Gomer is nit kin Hemshech to the Sheishes Yomim, and the continuation of the pasuk is not a continuation to the 6 days. B'kavanos HaPasuk Malacha, in the theme of the pasuk, which is talking about Malacha, the two are not connected. No, that's Sveita Sugzman, an entirely different category of time, versus Asr Basiyas Malacha, which is prohibited to do Malacha. And therefore, they're similar to each other. So Rashi is doing a Sheishes Yamim. If I tell you of a Goymar, you might think that Sheishes Yamim leads to Uvayim HaShvi Shabbos. And I don't want to do that to you. I want to point out to you that Sheishes Yamim is distinct, separate, individual from Uvayim HaShvi Shabbos. And therefore I'm not going to mention, not even of a Goymar. So, we have now answered a bunch of questions. We've answered the question why Rashi starts with Sheishes Yomim and doesn't say anything else. We answered what's bothering Rashi in this pasuk, and we now understand how we reach this conclusion of Kol HaMakayim and Kol HaMachalo, that Yom Tiv and Shabbos are similar to each other because they are both not in the category of Sheishes Yomim. And Rashi has to emphasize that to us. So first of all, he mentions Sheishes Yomim because that's what's bothering him. Why does the pasuk say Sheishes Yomim? And he doesn't mention anything else, not even of a Goymar, because he wants to keep the Sheishes Yomim distinct from Uvayim HaShvi Shabbos. In the next two small paragraphs, we're going to answer a question with two different answers. Why does Rashi not mention the words Te'asim Malacha and the Dibur HaMaschil? L'cheira, Te'asim Malacha is the big deal here. The whole distinction is that in Sheishes Yomim Te'asim Malacha, and in the rest of it you can't do Malacha. So why does Rashi not mention Sheishes Yomim? Why does Rashi not mention the words Te'asim Malacha? So for that we have two reasons. It is euch nit meisef Te'asim Malacha, weil das ist doch Rishus. Und die Ausgeteiltkeit von Sheishes Yomim und Shabbos v'Moedes is in Isser Malacha. The Te'asim Malacha is something that's permissible. That during the 6 days a week, even though we said earlier that it's mitzvah saseh, or no, we're going to say in a moment that it's a mitzvah saseh, but he's going to say that Chazal encourage us to work on the 6 days a week, but nevertheless not a mitzvah. You don't have to work during the 6 days of the week. You're allowed to work during the 6 days of the week. Now, the distinction of the 6 days of the week, of Shabbos and the Moedes from the Sheishes Yomim is in the Isser Malacha. So in other words, since we want to focus here that on the rest of the Uvayim HaShvi Shabbos and the rest of the week, on Yom Shabbos and Yom Tiv, you're not allowed to do Malacha, we don't want to mention the words Te'asim Malacha, which would focus on the Rishus to do Malacha, if we want to keep the focus on the Isser Malacha, which is the ultimate point of this whole parsha, when to not do Malacha. So that's number one. So Rashi doesn't say Te'asim Malacha because we want to focus on the Isser Malacha, not on the Rishus to do Malacha in the 6 days. Here is another suggestion of a reason, and here's going to go back to what we said in the beginning of the Sikha, that sometimes Rashi mentions the beginning of a pasuk, and he means the whole pasuk, or a big part of the whole inyan, but by saying the first few words, he's letting us know that he's going to speak about the entire inyan. So we can apply that to here. Mit Sheishes Yomim made the Rashi klolos ha'inyan from Sheishes Yomim. Rashi means the whole concept of the Sheishes Yomim. Al derech mi b'vasos Eifed canal, similar to Vasos Eifed, which was mentioned earlier in Seif Beis. And he doesn't have to say the whole pasuk because he means the whole pasuk. He just doesn't say the whole pasuk. In other words, by saying Sheishes Yomim, he means Sheishes Yomim Te'asim Malacha. He doesn't have to say it because once he starts, he's indicating that he's going to speak about the whole inyan. So the Te'asim Malacha, two reasons why it doesn't say Te'asim Malacha, either because the focus here is on the Isser Malacha, not on the Rishus of the Malacha in the 6 days, or Itaka means Te'asim Malacha to be included, but he doesn't have to actually say it. By Sheishes Yomim, he's saying that I'm referring to the whole pasuk, or the whole inyan. We also asked why Rashi mentions first Mechalas HaShabbos, Mechalas HaMoedes, and then Mekayim HaMoedes. Why don't you why doesn't he start with the positive? So he's going to answer in the next paragraph. So immediately, this will also explain to us the order in Rashi. Frier kol mechalel chul and kol mekayim. He starts with kol mechalel. The Baal does their clothes. They can vergleich when Yom Tov Shabbos. Let it be up when Sheish Canal. Since the general comparison of Yom Tov and Shabbos is being learned from Sheish Yamim, kumt uis as the limud has been a gechil Yom Tov comes out. It's similar to what you said before about Tiyasa Malacha, that the limud here is about the desecration of Yom Tov. Dervas is mechalel Yom Tov tasiyas Malacha. Someone who desecrates Yom Tov by doing Malacha, was their meat is their over af and gedef and agbala from Sheishas Yamim, and by this he's crossing over the boundary of the 6 days. He's moving the goalposts. He's taking days that are outside of the Sheishas Yamim, and he's bringing them into the permissibility of Sheishas Yamim by doing Malacha. If it's Yom Tov and he does Malacha, what he's basically doing is he's saying that this day is part of Sheishas Yamim, when it isn't. So therefore, it's as if it was Mechal Shabbos. So when he takes a day and he tries to bring it into the Sheishas Yamim, he tries to pretend like it's a day that's mutter. What's he doing? It's as if someone were to say that Shabbos is part of the Sheishas Yamim. So the main limud here is about chilul, that you can't be mechalel yontif, because if you're mechalel yontif, it's as if you be mechalel Shabbos. So therefore, Rashi starts with mechalel as Shabbos, because that's the main limud over here. And from the negative, you can learn the positive. For the first statement, from that you can derive that someone who keeps Shabbos, keeps Yom Tov, it's as if he kept Shabbos. But that's not the primary limud. The primary limud is with regards to Chilul Yom Tov, that you can't move a Yom Tov day and pretend like it's one of the Sheishas Yom. And therefore, since the primary limud is Chilul Yom Tov, Rashi starts with Kol Machal Samayades. So that answers all of our questions. We've answered the question of why Rashi quotes Sheishas Yamim, because that's what's bothering Rashi. He's bothering Rashi why he says Sheishas Yamim, and the explanation why he says Sheishas Yamim is because it's a general akdama to the whole concept of the comparison of Shabbos and Yom Tov with regards to not doing malacha. That 6 days a week, 6 days is a unit of time in which malacha is allowed. Anything that does not fit into that concept is asur, and therefore Yom Tov and Shabbos are the same thing. They're both not part of Sheishas Yamim. And in other words, even though they might be it might be on a Tuesday, but it's not part of the entity of the Sheishas Yamim, which is the entity of Zman that's mutar b'malacha. And therefore, so it comes out that when Rashi asks the question, Mayin Shabbos says, Mayin Amir says Shabbos, that's actually the answer. The question of Rashi is, what's Sheishas Yom doing here? And the answer is because we're comparing Shabbos and Moedes. To understand the comparison of Shabbos and Moedes, you need to have Sheishas Yomim. You need to understand that both Shabbos and Moedes are not part of the Sheishas Yomim, and therefore they're the same thing. Kol Makayim, Kol Machalal, and Kol Makayim. And now we go to Yiddish Torah to the deeper element of Rashi. Yiddish Torah in the Pirush Rashi is to do with Chazal Zogit. Af Sheishas Yom Tavet. Zum Mitzvah say Chazal tell us that Sheishas Yom Tavet is a mitzvah. Das heißt, as Tam Malach b'Sheishas Me'achel is nit nar azach was is mutter al Torah. That doing Malach on the 6 days a week is not just something that's permissible according to Torah, nor is it a mitzvah. When a derech and avedis Hashem for Yidden, it is a mitzvah. It is actually a proper pathway for a Yid in serving Hashem. Ukiyodua. As es dar sein die Akdama von Bechol HaShatasa machen Akeli in Teva und demult kommt Berach Hashem Lekecha Berachas Hashem, as it's known, the first has to be a making of a receptacle to receive Hashem's brachas, which is doing the work, and then comes Berachas Hashem, then comes the Eibsh's bracha, which of course in Chassidus also refers to the fact of Avedis HaBerurim, that when we work with Elam Hazah, we transform it, we elevate it to Kedusha. So however you frame it, there is an ideal of doing malacha in the 6 days of the week. There say that anage, but conversely, this approach is only necessary when you're coming from the perspective of the physical body. The islapsus from the neshama in guf, the neshama, the way it is enclosed in the body, must be from guf, because the body conceals the neshama and operates in a bodily way. Therefore, al pitera zechvirim. He says they say al pitera darkei teva. Therefore, the neshama of the guf combo, the neshama, the way it's concealed in the guf, has to follow the natural order of things according to Torah. Al derech Chazal in Simchan Alanes. For example, Chazal say you can't rely on a miracle because you have to go first with teva. Din de bechuzah dino. Another thing Chazal tell us is that you're supposed to follow the law of the land. When the neshama comes down into the guf has to operate according to the world that it's in, according to the nature that it's in. But if you're looking solely from the perspective of the neshama, not only is there no necessity for malacha, there shouldn't be any malacha. But the neshama is nit begeder a guf etivei. Since the neshama is not in the same category as the guf, doesn't have the nature of the guf. And as the Rebbe Rashab said, that the neshama, only the guf went into galus. The Rebbe Rashab said. The Frierdiker Rebbe quoted it in Kastrama, I think, by the train station. But the Rebbe Rashab said that only our guf went into galus, but our neshama did not go into galus. So the neshama is not exiled by galus, and therefore does not have to fit in to the framework of a guf or of teva. The neshama stands higher than the concealed world. So therefore the neshama is constantly in front of the king, in front of Hashem. And when you're on the level of being in front of Hashem, is asiyas melacha b'doime von man demach v'kamei malka v'chulu. Doing malacha is similar to someone who signals with his fingers in front of the king, which even when you stand in front of the king, you have to stand in total bittul, in total humility, in total subservience. And if you even motion with your fingers, it's considered treason. So the neshama, when it's in the guf, has to follow the rules of the guf. That's what Torah says. But when the neshama is seen from its own perspective, the neshama is beyond the alabaster of the world, and therefore it's standing in front of the king. Doing a malacha would be like motioning with your fingers in front of the king. Similar to the fact that if someone's davening all day, is it asur b'malacha unafilu b'machvi kolayim kulay? He's not allowed to do malacha. He's not even allowed to signal with his fingers for the entire day. So even a neshama, even in the guf, if a person's in the middle of davening, then he doesn't do malacha, and if he davens the whole day, he doesn't do malacha the whole day. So the neshama, when it's outside of the parameters of the guf, is in front of the king. In front of the king, there's no malacha. And therefore, from the neshama perspective, there has to be an idea of tishbais, of resting from malacha. And these are the two extremes that are demanded in the Avodah Vayid. In the Sheishes Yamim, was demot is al pitei devar numenech mit nyani aguf is tavadem mitzaseh. During the 6 days, in the entity of time, when al pitei he is meant to be involved with bodily matters, with worldly matters. So then there's a mitzvah tavid work. Over in the tech for Shabbos for Yom Tiv, when by Eden is made and neshama, but on the days of Shabbos and Yom Tiv, when the light of the neshama is shining by the Yid, then he has to stand higher than the guf and the desires of the guf and the nature of the guf. Move on as Dan is by him abgefragt. It's understood that at that stage, the idea of malacha is totally how do you say abgefragt in English? It's oh man, the word escapes me, but it's out of the question. Malacha is out of the question. Abgefragt, maybe that's close enough. It's out of the question when you're during the 7 days of the week, the 6 days of the week. So the Torah says work. You got to work with the guf. But on Shabbos or Yom Tiv, when the neshama is higher than the guf, at that time malacha is out of the question. So that's the idea here, is that Hashem created two time periods. One time period where Sheishes Yamim, where the Torah says go into the world and make a difference in the world and work the world. And then there's another time period, and over here Shabbos and Yom Tov are equal. They're both not time of they're not part of Sheishes Yamim. and at this time the neshama is higher than going to work, and not only that, but the work is totally out of the question. When we bow, the neshama is hecher from guf galos, and since the neshama is higher than guf and higher than galos, like we said, viktes eich seif kosaf and guf, it ultimately impacts, affects the guf as the guf in the kavdem was the guf gefindt sich in agbalus v'galos, that although the guf is in its own limitations in exile, so by Yimeir Zayin der take if an neshama was hecher from gvul v'galus, nevertheless the strength of the neshama should outshine the guf, so it should be able to give him the light that's higher than guf, than gvul, and higher than golus, higher than limitations, and higher than golus. Bizes nemt aristam guf eich from golus knutas, to the point that the neshama should impact the guf, that it should take the guf out of golus, literally in the gula mitzvah shlema de Mashiach tzedkeinu b'karav mamish, through the gula mitzvah shlema ayidei Mashiach tzedkeinu b'karav mamish. So that's the deeper aspect of what we're learning over here. That there are times that the person has to realize that not only is he not allowed to do malacha, but he shouldn't even want to do malacha. He should be in a place that he's standing on such a level, he's so close to Hashem that malacha is out of the question. And when you reach that level, then the neshama could actually impact the guf to lift it up, to take it out of its own constraints, out of its own confines, and ultimately take it out of galus kipshuta b'karav mamish.